Hi, this is a mental podcast. After many months of silence, finally I'm back in business. Because last year I did the Edinburgh Festival. Afterwards, I turned professional on comedy. So it was a lot of try and error to find my balance. And I'm very happy. Finally, I'm back. And today I have a special guest. Is Dave. We met each other on Edinburgh Festival. He's a very funny comedian, and he has some really interesting mental health stories as well. So I'm very excited to introduce him. So Dave, you want to give yourself a little bit introduction to my audience?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I am a professional idiot who tries to use comedy in order to talk about mental health, and I suppose that's at least in part inspired by my own sort of history of mental ill health. But even that, I think, is kind of interesting. It's interesting, isn't it? That like whenever we talk about mental health, normally we talk about mental illness rather than the actual health benefit.
Mhm. And for you, I think it's very interesting that last year at Edinburgh Fringe, you had a show called Mental. Do you want to give me a little bit brief? What's the show about, and how come you have the idea to develop a show like this?
Yeah, well, I suppose like it's exactly off that point, like off the back of it, I always used to talk about mental illness. So I started developing anorexia when I was a teenager, and I did a show about it. And the show that I wrote a couple of years ago and did in Edinburgh last year, Mental, was all about trying to talk about mental health rather than mental illness. Because the point is, you don't have to be unfit before you start going to the gym. Why do we always wait to become unwell before we start looking after our mental health? So it was one of those weird ones that it was like a show about a show. So it touched on the anorexia. It certainly focused on recovery and stuff that happened after that show, but it was an attempt, I think, to try and talk positively about mental health and try and use humor in order to equip people with actual coping mechanisms that they could use in their day-to-day lives.
And you talk about the anorexia. I think it's very interesting for me because I grew up in a very like patriarchy society, and the beauty standards for women is very homogeneous. AKA woman needs to be always under 45 kilograms and as slim as possible. So because of this, I developed eating binge eating disorder when I was a teenager. And at that time, I was like daydreaming. My biggest wish in life is that, oh, I wish I'm so lucky I can develop anorexia and then I don't need to control anything anymore. So I really dreamed to get it. Of course, now I realize that's stupid. So for you, normally anorexia is a condition I only heard women got it. So how come you as a teenager boy you start to develop this condition, and when is your first time to realize, oh, this is an issue, I need to work on it?
Well, I think that's a really good question. To answer the first question, I mean, it was something, yeah, about 10 to 25% of anorexics are males. So I think it was certainly in the minority rather than the majority. And it was something that sort of started to develop rather than actually initially beginning. And it was loads of behaviors that started to get exacerbated, like weighing, calorie counting, exercising, body checking. But the irony was, for me, the eating disorder was very little about food. And I kind of realized that now with time and hindsight, that like it actually wasn't about trying to look a certain way, it was a distraction. And in the same way that people use drink or drugs or perhaps other substances, it was something that I used in order to numb myself. And I think there were loads of things, especially when I was a teenager, that, sort of I was trying to numb myself from. everything from exam stress all the way to puberty and like urges, and I didn't really know what to do with that, and then not feeling good enough, wanting to get a partner, scared of moving on, scared of failure, all of these kind of different things. And actually the eating disorder, in a weird way, was helpful because it dealt in hard facts, it dealt in numbers, it dealt in calories, it dealt in weights, dealt in like how many steps you'd walked. And I think that's a really uncomfortable thought, not to glorify, encourage, or promote eating disorders at all. For me, it was something that, in the short term, in the same way that with alcohol and drugs, you can enjoy it. But then if you become dependent on that for your enjoyment of everything, that's when you've got a problem. So I didn't realize that I got a problem with my food until I was sort of 4 or 5 years into it. And even when I did realize, I was kind of, I suppose, so deep in it then that it wasn't easy to give up because it was almost not a choice.
Mhm. And what's the tipping point when you realize, oh my God, this is a problem, I should check into it?
You know what? Like that's so I used to do a story about this, and like the problem is it's just not funny, and that's why I had to, like, you know what I mean? Like I wish it would be great if you see all of these comedians and they always have a funny story, but the realization moment wasn't really that exciting or funny. It was quite mundane. And I think that's where a lot of people's lives live. Like for me, it was, I got this job teaching English to international students at a private school. So it was just while I was studying at university, you would go down to these private schools and you would teach English as a foreign language. And I was teaching down in Cornwall, which is like the south west of England, and it's really remote, and the nearest village was 3 miles away. There was no shop. And when I arrived, all the food that was put on was pizza, pasta, chips. There was no healthy option. There was no calorie count. There's nowhere to prepare your own food. And that was a tipping point for me because I realized I always thought I had a control on food. It was amazing how I realized that food had a control on me. So I started getting genuine nightmares about the meal times. I honestly had a nightmare about donuts, which is just batshit crazy. And I think I started exercising in the middle of the night because I couldn't sleep. I started hiding food in my room, but that led to a rat infestation. So I started trying to avoid meals as much as possible. But then something that people don't commonly talk about with anorexia was I would binge, and I would binge in front of not only my fellow teachers but also my students as well. And the real turning point for me, again, is incredibly mundane, but a teacher came up to me and said, look, I've had bulimia 3 or 4 times. I find this a really tricky environment. Have you ever thought you might have anorexia? And that was honestly the first time someone asked me if I might have an eating disorder rather than telling me I did. And that was such a huge change for me.
Yeah, so you mean when people tell you you have eating disorder, you were like resisting the idea. But when people genuinely ask you to explore this possibility, somehow it clicked, and you are willing to look into this possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's two things there. One is like generally eating disorders, whenever you talk about them, you talk about control. And if we're going to talk about control, then I think it's mental that we wouldn't put that control back in that person's court and ask them rather than tell them. Because people that were telling me that I had anorexia were yet again just taking more control away from me. But I also think as well, I'll never forget a couple of years ago, it was years ago now, when it was Christmas time and I got boozed up and I fell over and I fell on my hand and I got this like really like big gammy and it was all sort of like bruised on my hand. And I'll never forget my housemate went, mate, like I'd get that checked out. And I wish that people had talked to me about my mental health like that instead of being all melodramatic or like it was a soap opera. I wish that
Mhm.
people had asked me because you know what the truth of the matter is, I don't want to be too hoity-toity about it, but if you started coughing and someone just went to you, I think that's cancer, you'd go, "Who are you? Like, what do you know? You're not a doctor. You don't know anything." But if someone said to you, "That cough sounds like my granddad's, and he had cancer," like, I don't want to scare you, but you might want to get that checked out. I think those are two very different approaches that will lead to two very different outcomes.
Yeah, I agree. So you talk about control. That's also what I read from eating disorder folks. For lots of people, they don't feel they have that control in their life. So they cling into this, which they can control for themselves, and create a sense of security. And may I ask, you don't have to answer, just uh see how comfortable you are. May I ask, now you're looking back when the eating disorder started, were you in some type of environment you didn't feel in control that
Yeah.
slowly developed it?
Yeah, on multiple fronts. So I think firstly, contrary to what a lot of people expect with mental health problems, I loved my childhood. I had an incredible school, amazing mates, brilliant teachers, loving family, and then I got noticed by this girl, and everything was perfect, and that was amazing. But that was also something that had a best before date. And that was something out of my control. And what was also out of my control was, do I focus on the here and now, on my friends, on my girlfriend, on my family, and enjoy the here and now to the detriment of my future? Or do I can all of that? Do I not see my girlfriend? Do I stop going out with mates and getting boozed up and doing all those teenage things to try and bet on my future that hopefully I will have something as enjoyable in future? So there was that control that was out of my mind. I also think, ironically, when I started restricting, my emotions were all over the place and they were out of control. I also think as well, my identity was really out of control as well. It's something that I've always really struggled with. Like, there seemed to me that a lot of my friends, because they were so great, they seem to have their own identity. You'd got the cool kid, you've got the sporty kid, you've got the geek, you've got the jock, you've got the and I didn't have anything like that, and this sort of became my identity label. People did start saying, "Oh, that's Dave, he's the anorexic," and that was just something that I had. It was my explanation. I also think in my personal life, my mum and dad, there was quite a lot of food around the house, so that was also a control of, like, instead of nibbling on bits, I would just be like, bam, no, I'm going to control it. I'm not going to have anything. And I think one of the things that, still being honest, that I think is so difficult is, I think control in any aspect of any person's life is incredibly difficult to come by.
Mm. Cool. Wow. It's a totally unexpected answer. You first said, I had a great childhood. I was like, oh, I hate you already.
Did you think it was going to be because of a negative sort of stimulus? And if you don't mind
Like
asking,
most of people. Yeah.
was that something that's quite kind of like for you, if you don't mind me asking, was like a negative sort of stimuli?
Yeah, like for me, it's that's two solo shows, maybe three solo shows away. So I think I don't want to talk too much on this episode, because I talk so much on every other episode, and also my solo shows. So basically, I was permanently in a very negative environment, poverty, discrimination, and physical mental abuse. So, and also the very patriarchy society, how they subject women, and in order to become the type of girl, the how to say, the society appreciates. I really tried to control myself to not eat, and back in China, like there's not much like nutrition education, so we teenager girls were trying all kinds of diet. Now thinking back, it's not a diet. They are diet like a egg and apple diet. Basically, eat one apple and one egg per day. That's all you eat, and in 15 days you are be slim. And now I'm like, this is suicide.
Mm.
So I think so. Most people I know have mental health issues are always from a very somehow negative childhood. So this is the first time anyone opened the statement by I had a great, fantastic childhood. Then I'm
I
like,
th
oh,
I honestly think though that is a reality that we're not talking about. For example, is it Sweden or Finland that have been voted the happiest nation in the world, but also have the highest suicide? You know, it's actually quite. I honestly remember thinking when I was at university, this was one of the things like this is kind of whizzing forward a couple of years, but everyone used to say when you went to university, they're going to be the best years of your life. And I don't know how helpful it is to tell someone that because I remember, waking up hungover on a Tuesday, surrounded by people that I just met in a place that I'd never been before, thinking, Christ, if this is the best my life's ever going to get, the rest of my life's going to be bollocks. And I think that there was, I think those binary and very clean sentiments really can be quite damaging sometimes. Of like people thinking, oh, everything's downhill from here, everything's uphill from here, because the truth of the matter and the truth of life is that things are very rarely completely good and completely bad. And I think that's something that I really struggle with. Of like, I was aware that there was this brilliant thing, but it was slipping away, and perhaps I would never get it back. And also, perhaps I might regret for the rest of my life that I don't get it back.
Mhm. Cool. And I have another question. So when you were teaching English, you realized, oh, had this epiphany. Okay, I might have a, eating disorder. And then from then, how did you treat the condition? Like, how did you take control in this situation?
Well, I mean, the honest and simple answer is I didn't, because I think, again, it's a big problem facing mental health is what do you do? Where do you go? Who do you speak to? I mean, there's all of this bollocks about just talk. And you know what? If I could have just talked, I'd have sorted it out myself. I always say that for me, the eating disorder was a way to show with my body that there was something wrong with my brain. But I didn't know how you dealt with that. And all of the stories, specifically about anorexia, I felt were always the extreme cases. There were always people that weighed less than a packet of crisps, or there were always people who had a sort of thorax that looked like a toast rack, or were like minutes from death. And that certainly wasn't me. And I still certainly don't think that I ever looked shockingly thin. So I was like, what do I do with this? I can't go to a GP because surely they'll laugh me out of the door and say, like, mate, you are making something out of nothing. Or perhaps even worse, they'll go like, yeah, you do have a problem, but let's wait until it becomes a real problem, and that make me feel like a fraud. So yeah, I did nothing about it, and that enabled the condition to become more exacerbated. And that's the really tricky period that I find to explain, because it would be easier for a narrative to say, then I went to a doctor and everything was perfect. But what actually happened was I used it. So when I was doing well, so I left university and I moved to London, and that bit was really, really fraught. I got finals, I got move out days, and I was restricting more and more and more. And it wasn't even a conscious thing. It was just a way to distract me from my own life. But then when I did move to London and when I did get this incredible job with amazing people, being me was all right. So I kind of almost forgot about the restriction, and I went out with mates and I got muffins at lunch and all of those kind of things. And then I put on a little bit of weight and someone highlighted to me like, oh, you put on weight, and that made me think about my body again. So it kind of went in and out, in and out, and I was very sort of wobbly. And until I did go full time in comedy, and I think that brings a whole remit of stresses with it. And again, everything was perfect. Again, everything was like, this is what you've always dreamed of. You are doing a job you love. However, with that comes a lot of comparison. And I was spending my days waking up when everyone else was at work, going to work when everyone else was socializing. So it was incredibly isolating. I was spending my days looking on Facebook and seeing everyone doing seemingly better than me. I'd spend times feeling like a fraud. And the anorexia became a way to distract myself, and it became a passive suicide intent. Like I knew that anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. I knew that one person dies from anorexia every 62 minutes. So I actually did. What?
I love when you quote the statistics.
Well, I knew all the stats, and this is what kind of gets me is people use those to shock me, and I was like, yeah, I want to kill myself. Like, what do you, what like, do you think that's gonna make me go, oh, this thing is bad? Oh, it's like saying to someone who's like shooting up heroin, going, by the way, that's not good for your health. I don't think any heroin addict is gonna put down the crack pipe and go, seriously, I thought this was better than getting a Peloton. Oh my God, it's you just I knew it was bad. I knew it was a problem. I knew I was killing myself, and that at that point was what I wanted.
Mhm. I think it's interesting, like you said, okay, you start to going professional in full time in comedy, and that's isolating because for average people, they always glorify how a comedian live. Oh, you are crowded by all the fans, audience, like you are always socializing, but actually it's a very isolating career.
Yeah.
I like because when people are having fun, you are working, and when you have time, everyone else is working, so it's very hard to make social plans with people outside of comedy. And lots of people we meet talk with at the comedy shows, they it's hard to build very deep connections in this kind of situation.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why I actually don't generally refer to myself as a comedian, because stand-up comedy is something you do. A comedian is something that you are. And when I was younger and naive, I would hear all of these stories because, like a lot of people, I got into stand-up comedy because I went to comedy and I loved it and I became a nerd of it. I became obsessed about it. And I remember watching, stories of people like sort of Russell Howard or Russell Kane or John Oliver, all of these people that they just made it sound like their day was constantly traipsing from one crazy story to the next. Whereas actually that's not true. It is something that you do rather than something you are. And I think I don't mean this with any malice, but actually like a lot of to be honest, most stand-up comics are some of the most depressed people, mentally unwell people I know. It is incredibly isolating.
Yes, yes. So I was actually going to ask you, how did you decide to do comedy, and when was like the tipping point? You were like, okay, this is my first time I'm going on stage.
Again, even that's really difficult to explain because when I got into comedy, I always wanted to do comedy in order to talk about things. So I got into it because when I was at university, there was this comedy club that ran every 2 weeks, and they had just some amazing acts. I remember seeing people like Rufus Hound. We saw people like Tom Crane. We saw people like I think Hannah Gadsby did it once. All of these kind of like people before they were famous, obviously. But the thing that really got me and the thing that really stuck with me about the comedy is that people were using it as a way to cope. Because when you actually listen to all of these people, they were actually saying really dark things about being broke, about being single, about being the least favorite child or not knowing what they wanted to do with their life. But the fact that they were joking about it made it manageable. And I was like, that is amazing. So I always wanted to write about comedy. And I think even back then I was kind of like, yeah, it'd be lovely to write about the sort of anorexia. And I started writing the show about the anorexia, ironically, at the same time that I had to go into hospital for the anorexia. And it was like, fucking hell, this is mental. But like they kind of ran parallel, and it was a really unique experience because I did a show. Basically, I kind of ramped up. So I did a show with a brilliant comedian called Robin Perkins, who is to this day one of my best mates. And we did this 2 half-hour show where I did half an hour about anorexia. She did half an hour about losing her partner when she was 29, and it was called Over It, Death, Anorexia, and Other Funny Things. And it was an amazing show to do, but it meant that I didn't go from nothing to doing an hour. I kind of went from half an hour to doing 60 minutes. And I kind of created a rod for my own back, because even in that half hour talking about anorexia, people would come up and sort of say, "Oh, you don't look anorexic." Or I remember specifically one guy stopping me in the street and sort of saying, "Oh, like, mate, I saw your show and it really stuck with me," which is really lovely. But I just happened to be eating an apple at that time, and eating an apple, and then I was like, "Oh God, I look like a fraud." And again, it became this identity label, and I was like, well, look, I've just got to be, if I'm going to talk about this, I've got to be the best at this. And it really exasperated it.
So, this reminded me to ask you the next question. I remember on stage you mentioned after one Edinburgh show, a reviewer came to you, questioning your credibility in the eating disorder, and that sent you to like a downward
Yeah.
spiral. Do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was that year that I was really struggling, and I was with Robin, who I mentioned earlier on, Robin Perkins, in the Loft Bar in the Gilded Balloon, and we were standing in the little conservatory area. And I'll never forget, I was talking to a reviewer who I'd got to know then, and who, being a young, naive kind of former sort of, yeah, just sort of start out, and it was my first full run, and I was like, oh my God, I'm talking with this person who writes for this thing that is so, and she's been on telly and all this. And she'd taken this person had taken a seeming sort of interest. They'd lived down the road from my house, and I used to see her when I went, and I gave her a flyer, and she was like, "Oh, I want to come and see your show." And this person does charitable work in Africa, which is, I think, is incredible. But that person then turned around and said, "You know what? They don't have anorexia in Africa," which subsequently they absolutely do. And this person went on then to say, I think it's actually just because you want to feel special. This is just a way for you to try and sort of create a problem, because you are a white middle class man who has got loads of privilege. So you're just creating something in order to moan about. And I don't say this in the show, but the genuine truth of the matter, this is honestly true. I remember it was, it stung me so much, and it was so personal. And I had that bit, when you can feel the blood pulsing in your head.
Yeah.
And I was like, I was I wasn't even angry. I don't know what you would describe it as. I felt so personally attacked. It was everything that I'd worried everyone would ever think about it. And especially as this person that was saying it has a long history of eating disorders themselves. So I was kind of like, where is this coming from? This is really bizarre, to go from a really nice conversation to being so attacked by this. What's going on? And and as I stood there, kind of rooted to the spot, all of a sudden Al Murray came around and just hugged her and picked this person that I'd been speaking to up. And then I think it might have been John Bishop as well, was there in this conversation. And it was like such a surreal experience. Do you know what Edinburgh's like? And you know what those VIP bars are like? Of like, everyone's trying to impress other people. And I just remembered like seeing these two people that I've grown up watching on telly, and I was still so kind of not in my right headspace from what was going on. And I just said to Robin, like, I gotta get out of here. Because I was like, normally it'd be like, oh my God, I want to speak to these people. But it really stuck me. And it was one of the kind of primary factors in order to enable me to move towards that route of relapsing.
Hmm. And how long the relapse happened?
I think, like, again, because it's not it's very sort of woolly, but I was very openly relapsing for a good couple of years. And then, and I remember it might have been that evening going home and buying like very unhealthy methods in order to sort of make me lose more weight, but also to, I don't want to give any tips out, but anorexia can kill you in a number of different ways. And one of the worst ways is like, organ failure, and I have quite a high correlation of like heart disease in my family. So I started taking things in order so that heart failure is quite common with anorexia as well, so that I would die by a heart attack or heart failure rather than like kidney or liver function. I started buying those things in order to sort of like harm my heart so that that would sort of like kill me first before like kidney sort of loss and stuff like that. I'm fairly sure it was like that day or maybe the day after, and I remember they arrived, and the people that I was living with then, who actually no longer do comedy, sort of said to it, like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, you bought this is really dangerous. And again, I was like, I know it's dangerous.
Wow. And I'm so sorry for this. A- And and I want to ask you, how did you do, do you identify the eating disorder is already in the past, or is something you actually battle with?
You know what? I think it's a really good question. And I'm always really careful with that because, especially with lockdown, I think it really exacerbated a lot of my problems with food. And not now, but a good couple of weeks ago, I was in quite a not a bad way with food at all, but like started to feel a lot of those things again. So, a really nice way that I've heard someone describe it before that I really loved was someone said, I've retired from it, which I thought was a really beautiful way of putting it. Of like, it's always going to be there, and you're always going to have the knowledge and stuff, but you know, you might do the odd stint, but it's not something I'd go back to. And I also think I've had so much incredible help and support, and more than anything, a help to understand the underpinnings of it all. That I honestly don't think that it's something that I'm particularly in danger of going back to. But it is something that will always be there. It's something that I kind of feel nearer to or further away from. Perhaps, you know, like people have IBS flare ups. Perhaps it's something, you know, a similar kind of thing there of like sometimes I'll have a flare up of like, oh, that's not a good way to see food or to see exercise or to understand your body. Um, and yeah, I think it's something I've always got to keep on top of.
Yeah, I think retired from this condition is a very good expression. For me, I battle with depression, and I would say I'm no longer actively depressed, but it's something I need to always have an eye for. But once a while, I would have a glimpse of what's it like, and it just kick back a little bit. But because I have all the tools and all those countermeasures, so when it comes back, I make sure it's only like 1 day or 2 days. So for you, when some does the eating disorder come back once a while, and when that happens, what do you do?
You know what? I'm very jealous of that, and I think it's a really good question because I think fundamentally for me, one of the problems with mental health is it's very rarely something like IBS that starts. It's not like heartburn or a headache. It's something that actually starts to go on over time. And I would like to say that I have all of my red flags. I would like to say I know that when this and this happens, I'm in the sort of yellow zone and I need to shift back towards green. But being completely honest and authentic, I don't have that, and it's something that I am focusing on, and it's something that I need to improve on. I certainly know that there are things like irritability and getting grumpy and getting quite angry. That's normally a sign that things aren't right. Perhaps sleeping more, certainly being more distracted, and also starting to kind of put things off and constantly what's the word where you put things off, what's it called? um
Procrastination.
Procrastination, that's right, when I'm procrastinating.
Oh,
What's
I
a
just told British people English word. Oh my God, I'm so proud.
There you go, that's on the poster next year.
Yeah.
That's great. And I think there's so many of those little warning signs, but I think I honestly don't have a hard and fast rule. And I don't know, maybe I am in the minority there, but I think for a lot of people, mental health is something that always ticks along in the background. And I think it's something I always want to continue to get better at. But in the same way with physical health, I think very few people realize that they're out of shape. There'll be one or two things of like you run for a bus or something, and you're like, oh, Jesus, I'm out of shape. Um, but I don't think there is any short term, like, if you were out of shape running for the bus, it's not like you can go home, drink a power shake, bam, you're svelte, you're fine, you're good. It takes time, and it's kind of gradually trying to move in that right direction.
And I heard, I'm aware that you have a book about your journey of eating disorder. What's the name of the book? And if my audience is interested, how can I find the book?
Well, thank you for asking. I mean, I originally, because the book was about anorexia, I originally wanted to call it The Real Hunger Games because I thought that was a good title. I wasn't allowed to use that. So it's called Weight Expectations, and you can get it on Amazon or different bookshops. And the book is broke down. It's meant to be fun, it's meant to be whimsy, but it uses like this psychological theory of change called the trans-theoretical model. So it could be used for people who don't even have eating disorders but just want to change, whether that is quitting smoking, whether that is getting a little bit healthier. It kind of uses a research background in order to apply that to people's everyday lives.
Oh, cool. So one last question. For me, comedy helped me a lot. Because I live in a society where everyone pretend they are perfect, and then under the perfect outlook, everyone else feels so insecure that everyone else is perfect. So for me, I permanently feel isolated and ashamed of how I feel, what I have been through, until I start to get to know stand-up comedy. There were a few comedians, they really turned their struggle, their pain, their depression into really, really great comedy, and that inspired me a lot. Because in their comedy is so real, like the struggles they have been through, but the ability they can make it funny, it's really mind blowing for me. And every time when I feel down or when I feel lost a little bit of hope, I would watch those. So in your case, do you know or do you recommend one or two like comedy shows which talk about the issue you were facing?
Great. I mean, it's a great question. I think in terms of actually talking about eating disorders and dealing with that, I don't think I have a specific comedy show, although I will say that I do have certain things that I listen to when I'm on particularly a down day or will watch. And Mrs. Doubtfire, by far and away, is always my go-to pick-me-up film. I love it for so many different reasons. Not only is it bulletproof funny, not only is it got an incredible cast and amazing acting by a beautiful Robin Williams, but I also think one of the things that I really like about Mrs. Doubtfire is It was made in 1993, which was at a time when a lot of the Disney-esque endings had, is a happily ever after. But actually, at the end of the film, it's actually really dark. Like the mum and the dad don't get together. The family does break up. There's so many unanswered questions, and I think actually that always really stuck with me as a kid of like that seemed really authentic and honest. So although that's not stand up, and there are some brilliant stand ups out there that are doing amazing things with mental health, such as the brilliant Joe Wells, such as Chelsea Birkby, such as Harriet Dyer, Susan Kalman, Sophie Hagen, Felicity Ward, Money Zhang. I mean, there's loads of people, but I think it would be Mrs. Doubtfire for me.
And do you have, besides your book, do you have another go-to book that helped you with your mental health to recommend to my audience?
In terms of like books for mental health, I think I really find the Harvard Business Review did a whole series on things like resilience and confidence, etc. I think that's really, really useful. Um, but I think on a more down to earth level, my favorite book of all time is Danny Wallace's Yes Man. And I think I that really helped me when I was a teenager because the idea of growing up felt so intimidating. It felt like everyone had been given a manual for life, and I was the only one that had missed out. I might have been taking a whiz while they'd given it, and I was like, oh, I'm not equipped. Whereas Yes Man is just this perfect example of like living life to the full, but in a very kind of down to earth, you can do it yourself way. So I think that would be my recommendation for that.
Cool, thank you so much. I have one last question, I promise. Not necessarily mental health recommended, but as a person who do comedy full time, if you need to recommend one or two, your favorite comedy special, which we can easily find on Netflix or YouTube or other platform, so which are your go-tos?
That is an incredibly mean question, Money. I think that is unbelievably difficult. I
Okay, but you cannot recommend anyone you know personally. Is
I
that
think it's
more friendly?
yeah, no. I think it's a great question. I think it's from a comedian, but it's not comedy. Stuart Lee has a brilliant talk online, and it's called Stuart Lee on not writing. So if anyone's listening this who is a comedian and is struggling with writer's block or whatever, I would absolutely implore you, Stuart Lee on not writing. I think
So it's a
that
book.
no, it's a YouTube. It's
Okay.
on YouTube and it's absolutely brilliant. And then I would say, in terms of just comedians, for me, I love Robin Williams and I think he was brilliant, but I think he would be shortly pipped to the post by the ineffable, incredible Eddie Izzard. And any Eddie Izzard show, I think what he was doing was genuinely so groundbreaking. I still watch it now and I'm like, I find that mad. So I think Eddie Izzard is always great.
Okay, cool. I always like a comedian's recommendation because for me, I only knew the art form 2 weeks before I started to do comedy. So I was like very uneducated. So I'm very, very happy for other people's recommendation to educate me more and more. And Dave, I'm so happy to have you and so happy finally we have this chat. I definitely check out the resource you recommended. I really cannot wait for Edinburgh 2023 and to
And
see what
Brighton.
brings to us. Cool. So then we'll see each other in Brighton in
Yeah,
May, and definitely the whole month we'll rock Edinburgh.
can't wait. Thank
Mhm.
you so much, Had. I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Have a good day and stay healthy.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Bye.